I'm Kip Davis, and welcome to my channel. I am a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is my final video responding to Inspiring Philosophy's presentation on the Capturing Christianity channel, The Reliability of Genesis 1 to 11. If you haven't already watched the previous videos, then go ahead and click on the link in the playlist in the description, and make sure you also take the time to view Michael Jones's original video to see that I have got this right. In the final section of his talk, which I will cover here, he focuses on citations of Genesis by other biblical writers in order to demonstrate its antiquity and on undefined parallels between Genesis and ancient Near Eastern stories and myths. He further makes arguments on consistencies in spelling or grammatical features and other similarities in language. He finishes with a brief overview of supposedly artistically derived poetic alterations and chiastic patterns in a selection of Genesis passages that he posits are impossible to reconcile with the source theories, which I covered in the previous video. Jones brushes through this stuff pretty quickly, and to an untrained eye or without careful consideration of what he is saying, it might appear really compelling. However, upon close inspection, his entire argument is on several points either completely irrelevant, unclear, or simply misleading. First, let's talk about the awareness of Genesis by later biblical authors.
If Genesis was around during the monarchy and whatnot, shouldn't other authors have mentioned it? Jeremiah 4 has strong correlations to Genesis 1. The fall of Lucifer in Genesis 3 seems to be mentioned in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. The fall of Adam seems to be mentioned in Job 15 and Isaiah 6 as well. Divine knowledge is hinted at in 1 Kings 3. There seems to be some sort of play there. Themes from Genesis 2, well, the tree of life. In the tabernacle, when they were making the tabernacle in Exodus, the lamppost is based on the tree of life. By allusion in Psalm 19, the tree of knowledge of good and evil is correlating to the law of God. Sin in the garden meant exile. Sin under the Mosaic covenant meant exile. There's a divine test of obedience in Deuteronomy 8, which is correlating to what we see in the garden covenant. Isaiah 24 might reference the flood account.
This is not something that is at all contested by anyone, but it is also something that is in no way remarkable. Let's be clear here. From this entire catalog of allusions or citations, there is but one, even remotely obvious one. And that's Jeremiah's reversal of creation in Jeremiah 4 as a description of Babylon's destruction of Jerusalem. Beyond this, all the rest are post hoc insinuations that don't really track directly from the biblical texts themselves. Take, for example, the so-called Eden myth that appears in Isaiah chapter 14 and especially in Ezekiel chapter 28. We are accustomed to reading this story back onto Genesis 3 to 4 because that is traditionally how the church has done it for thousands of years. But on the face of it, it is not even clear that the Eden story is in view here by Ezekiel. Verse 13 makes explicit mention of Eden, the garden of God, but then virtually the entire rest of the poem has nothing at all to do with Genesis 3. Here is my translation of Ezekiel 28, starting in verse 14. And I have juxtaposed this against one of my favorite versions of the Genesis 3 story to make a point about their dissimilarity. You seriously need to go buy these books. Go. Get it done. Now. An anointed guardian cherub, I set you on God's holy mountain. You walked between the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until iniquity was found in you. By your far-flung commerce, you were filled with violence, and you sinned. So I have hurled you out from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, guardian cherub, from among the stones of fire. Your heart became proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by your brightness. I have thrown you to the earth I've exposed you before the gaze of kings. By the greatness of your guilt, through the dishonesty of your trading, you desecrated your sanctuaries. I brought forth fire from within you, and it has consumed you. I've reduced you to ashes on the earth before all who see you. All who knew you among the peoples are horrified by you. You have become a horror and have ceased to be forever. There is no snake here, no tree of knowledge, no temptation of the naked man and woman, no inquiry by God into their sin. If anything, this intriguing passage reveals an otherwise untold story of creation that is completely different from what we see in Genesis 3. Next, Jones makes some claims regarding the affinities of Genesis with other ancient Near Eastern literature. Citing Gordon Wenham, he says,
"It is strange that the two accounts of the flood, so different as J and P, circulating in ancient Israel, should have been combined to give our present story, which has many more resemblance to the Gilgamesh version than the postulated sources." In other words, they'll say the flood account that we have in Genesis is really a combination of J and P sources. But separate, they don't match Genesis, or they don't match Gilgamesh. Combined, however, they just magically line up to form what we see in, to make the parallels that we see with Gilgamesh flood account. Why is it that the early sources don't match up, but somehow they're put together and they match up perfectly with Gilgamesh?
He goes on to cite Richard Hess in making a similar claim regarding the similar structure of the two creations in Genesis 1 to 2.
Genesis 1 and 2, Hess also notes, matches how early Sumerian accounts were sort of put together in their literary structure. And he mentions one, the Enki and Ninmah.
Jones recently released a new video on his channel which more comprehensively unpacks this point, in particular with regards to the flood story. And it is something that I have plans to, within the next few weeks, review in cooperation with Myth Vision Podcast. But for now, it is difficult to know what to do with these assertions without knowing precisely how Wenham, Hess, or Jones understand resemblances or similarities in structure. Contrast this with the claim of Michael D. Coogan when speaking about the flood stories in Genesis 6 to 9 that the detailed parallels between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical account, especially J, are so close that the biblical writers must have been familiar with some pre-existing Mesopotamian flood story. Note the important qualification here. The resemblances with Gilgamesh are observed in J, not with any of the material that scholars have assigned to P. Moreover, on my own reading, I don't see anything within the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, where the flood story is told that so seamlessly aligns with the combined biblical story to the peril of either one or the other of J or P. On the contrary, I do see that in Gilgamesh, as in J, the earth was submerged by heavy rains. This is unlike the P version, where the floodwaters burst forth from the fountains of the deep. Notice also that the passage Coogan specifically highlights from the Epic of Gilgamesh to illustrate his point features both this text and J releasing a series of birds to search for dry land, whereas in P, there is no such counterpart. Jones then goes on to speak of consistent spelling and
the Pentateuch preserves anomalous grammatical features that occur across the sources divides, but are found much less frequently in the other parts of the Hebrew Bible.
He specifically identifies the epicene spelling of the third singular independent pronoun who, which is commonly masculine, but in 212 instances throughout the Pentateuch, it functions syntactically as feminine. This might seem impressive if it were a feature that was exceptionally rare elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, appearing outside of the Pentateuch, but actually, it occurs another 286 times between Joshua and Chronicles. And then Jones makes a series of claims about the use of sevens in the first 4 chapters of Genesis.
There's internal consistency with the use of 7. We see a lot of 7s building up. And if you divide the sources, you don't get this.
On the screen, he shows several instances where words, names, or phrases occur in groups of 7 in the first few chapters of Genesis. Within the story of Cain and Abel, the word brother shows up 7 times, and the word Cain shows up 14 times. In Genesis 1, verse 1 contains 7 words, and verse 2 has 14 words. The word for earth, again, Jones can't seem to type the Hebrew in the proper direction, shows up 21 times, and so on and so forth. It is important to note here that I think Jones is taking for granted that his audience doesn't understand enough about the source theories to know how scholars have divided them. Notice that most of his examples are restricted to texts appearing between Genesis 2 and Genesis 4. And while I personally don't think there is any intentional grouping of 7s by the author in these texts, even if there were, we could assign virtually every one of these to the author of J, since J traditionally stretches from Genesis 2:4 to 4:26 without interruption. I'm going to come back to this point shortly, but first, Jones thinks he makes a clever point by the usage of the 2 names for God, Yahweh and Elohim.
There are 70 times God is mentioned, either as Yahweh or Elohim, and accumulates in Genesis 4:26 with people calling on the name of the Lord. Now, if you go to Genesis 2:4, there's 35 times you see the name Yahweh. Between Genesis 2:1 and Genesis 2:4, the word for Elohim shows up 35 times. Someone is doing this on purpose. This doesn't just come together by collecting J and P sources and E sources. This is not what you would get with that kind of thing.
So this is simply incorrect. Yahweh appears only 30 times throughout the first 4 chapters of Genesis, not 35. And these all appearing after Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. Elohim occurs 36 times, also not 35, between Genesis 1, verse 1 to 2, verse 4. Now, I suppose it could be 35 times if we assign the final occurrence at the end of 2:4 to the second half of the divide between the sources, as scholars tend to do. But this then raises another problem. Those 30 occurrences of Yahweh appearing in Genesis 2:5 to 4:26 are distinguished by another feature. Consistently throughout the J creation story, in Genesis 2:4 to 3 verse 23, God is referred to not merely as Yahweh, but as Yahweh Elohim. This means that there is an additional 19 occurrences of Elohim in Genesis 2:5 to 4:26. So then, in total between Genesis 1 and 4:26, there are 60 occurrences of Elohim and only 30 of Yahweh, for a total of 90. The usages of these 2 words are not neatly divided equally to total 70, and their usages are not consistent at all, except according to their source assignments. Jones goes on to make a number of claims about internal consistency on patterns and similarities in word usage, birth formulas, occupation, and the like sort. However, it is crucial to note that most of his arguments for internal consistency are restricted to texts between Genesis 2 to 4.
You can see the 3 birth announcements of Genesis 4 have similar language. The same Hebrew construction occurs for occupations in Genesis 4. Adam and Cain have the same occupations. Their sins are both connected to fruit. They're both questioned the same way. They're both sentenced the same way. And they're both punished the same way. Same grammatic structures are flowing from Genesis 3 to Genesis 4. There's poetic alterations as well. And Abel became a keeper of the flocks, and Cain became a keeper of soil. There's sort of these poetic sort of building ideas on it. There's lexical and linguistic similarities. Genesis 3:9 pairs with 4, 13 with 10. Get the idea. It seems very much like this is sort of an internal consistent work in that sense.
As I just noted, the problem here is either that Jones does not understand how the sources are divided, or he is counting on his audience to not be aware of it. All these patterns or similarities that appear in this section of the text are in no way a problem for the source theories, all of which assign the material in Genesis 2 to 4 to the same source, notably J. So, all that Jones has managed to illustrate here is that the source, J, is internally consistent, what actually reinforces the strength of the documentary hypothesis when this source consistency is compared to the mess that is the combined text of the preserved Pentateuch. Finally, Jones believes that poetic alterations and chiastic patterns demonstrate an internal consistency in Genesis that contradicts the source theories. Again, several of these are restricted to texts in Genesis 2 to 4 that we readily agree can all be assigned to the same author, most likely J. However, he does briefly show a large chiasm that apparently exists in the flood story in Genesis 6 to 9. For those who don't know, chiasm is a literary device that appears occasionally in ancient texts, whereby the text can be structured on the basis of theme or language into an inverted format. I illustrated one of these in the second video in this series using the cleverly edited text of Deuteronomy 32, verses 41 to 43. Another more obvious example appears in Genesis 9, verse 6. The one who sheds blood of a man, by man his blood will be shed. These sorts of poetical constructions are scattered throughout the Hebrew Bible, but some have on occasion sought to show much more elaborate chiastic patterns across larger and more complex sections of the text, which is precisely what Jones is doing here with a flood story. In his estimation, between Genesis 6:10 to 9:19, there is an obvious complex chiasm consisting of 15 opposite pairs that culminates with the expression in chapter 8, verse 1, God remembered Noah. His argument is that a chiastic pattern like this would be impossible in view of the source theories, which holds that the Genesis flood story is combined from two sources, J and P.
Seems very unlikely if they were sort of combining these things to put them together in that sense.
At a glance, it appears impressive. But since Jones devotes virtually no attention to the particulars of this chiasm, it is worth a more careful inspection. Now, at the outset, it is important to bear in mind that while simple chiasms like those just illustrated are obvious and intentional, scholars are mixed in their opinion about some of those which are more elaborate. Some have suggested that the apparent phenomenon of structuring literature in patterns as such may actually be more natural or intuitive than it is intentional. That is, a chiastic structure may simply be a subconscious product of writing, or, in the case of the biblical texts are concerned, of editing. And of course, many of these elaborate chiastic constructions depend on the selecting criteria posed by the reader or interpreter, which are subject to their own biases and not often obviously derived from the text itself. In other words, large chiasms are more in the eye of the beholder than they are in the plans of the author. The chiasm cited by Jones for Genesis 6:10 to 9:19 was first proposed by Isaac M. Kikawada and Arthur Quinn in their 1985 volume Before Abraham Was, The Unity of Genesis 1 to 11. As mentioned, it is contrived from 15 pairs of opposites that converge in Genesis 8:1, but look closely at the appearance of these supposed pairs and you will notice that there are sections of the text which are not present at all. There is no counterpart offered for Genesis 6:11 to 13, or verse 22, for chapter 7 verse 6, chapter 8 verse 2, verse 14, or chapter 9 verses 5 to 7. If this were truly a chiasm, then these sorts of gaps in the structure would not exist. This chiasm has been constructed from a supposed pattern of themes throughout the text. Mentions of the ark, of numbers of days, of the flood, the covenant, and so forth. However, in a text Like the flood story, where so many of these words and ideas are repeated so frequently, it is unsurprising that one could intuit a pattern in their usage, even where one does not exist. For example, Jones has isolated Genesis 6 verses 14 to 16, and on the counterpart, chapter 9 verse 18a, as opposite pairs, on the basis of the mention of Tava, the ark, which he identifies as pair C. And then again in chapter 7 verse 1 to 3, and its counterpart in chapter 8 verse 15 to 16 as pair G, on the basis of God's command to enter and then to leave the Tava, or the ark. But within the entire passage, the word Tava appears 26 times. And these account for 93% of every single appearance of this word in the entire Hebrew Bible. The only other two usages of the word occurring in the story of Moses' rescue from the Nile River by Pharaoh's daughter in Exodus 2 verses 3 and 5. Moses was drawn from the Tava, the ark, the reed basket that his mother had constructed. Also, one of these pairs slips in its ordering of the elements. Take a look at pair M in 7 verses 17b to 18 and chapter 8 verse 5, and also pair N in chapter 7 verse 19 to 20 and its counterpart in 8 verse 4 and 5. These are structured on the mention of the water in the former and the mountains in the latter. However, the pattern is disrupted by 8 verses 4 to 5, which first says that the ark came to rest al-Harai Ararat, on the mountains of Ararat. Second, Vahamayim hayu halok, the waters subsided. But then once more mentions that the tops of the mountains were uncovered. Neru roshe heharim. It also makes mention of the waters, Garvu Hamayim, in the middle of pair N. If this were an intended part of an elaborate chiasm, then the writer would not have so sloppily set the receding water between the identification of the mountains of Ararat and the appearance of the mountain peaks and the increasing waters in the middle of the peaks being overwhelmed. As several scholars have complained about numerous other such elaborate chiasms, this one in Genesis 6 to 9 seems extremely contrived. For example, one of the pair is supposedly found in 6 verse 21 and 9 verse 1 to 4 on the basis of the word la'achla, to eat. This is pair F. The first of the pairs says, "Take for yourself every kind of food and gather it together, for it shall be for you and them food." That is, in order to sustain Noah and his family on their nautical voyage. But then look at the opposite pair cited to be in the substantially larger passage in the first 4 verses of chapter 9. God blessed Noah and his sons. He said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will consume every animal on the ground, every bird of the air, everything that crawls in the dirt, and every fish of the sea. I give them into your hand." There is no mention of food until verse 3. "Everything that moves and lives will be your food. I give to you all the green plants, but you are not to eat the flesh with the breath, its blood." There is a highly generic connection between these passages on the directive by God concerning food, but the contents of his construction in both have such a broad relationship with one another as to make any connection essentially meaningless. It is these sorts of strained connection between passages that are required to make elaborate chiastic structures like this one function, but also which effectively demonstrate that they are more often than not invented by the interpreter well after the fact, and not at all designed by the author. So, this is the end. And what have we learned in this long series of videos? A few things, I think. First, the amount of energy and effort expended by pop apologists like Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy into establishing the antiquity and coherence of the book of Genesis indicates something really important about their own agendas. Jones himself has an entire series of videos dedicated to a serious appraisal of the meaning of Genesis.
But if we're going to be honest with ourselves, if we want to know what this text is saying, we need to try to understand it in its original culture and language.
I think it is telling that while making an appeal to the importance of knowing the original culture and language of Genesis, Jones shows us two images of the same manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this is not a copy of the book of Genesis. It is rather an ancient version of the book of Isaiah. This is followed by an image of a medieval Torah scroll, but this also does not depict text from Genesis. It is rather Leviticus 11 and 12. This could be merely cosmetic, stock photos of random Jewish manuscripts to dress up his video presentation. However, I tend to think that this is indicative of a problem with Jones's teaching on this subject as a whole. That he doesn't actually know Hebrew. That he did not recognize the text of the manuscript on display, and he took for granted that his audience wouldn't either. And this is troubling. He likes to make a show about what the text actually says, but nothing I see indicates that he really knows it. I mean, really knows it. These sorts of bloviating appeals serve to convince his audience that despite the sophisticated and overwhelming scholarly challenges to traditional views of Genesis, there is something redeemable within the ancient culture and language from which to make a case for the specialness of the Bible. Such a case is difficult to mount without resolving the cavalcade of issues within the first book in the collection. Second, Jones's presentation on the Capturing Christianity channel is a long exercise in strawman arguments, false dichotomies, and special pleading. At the start of his presentation, he informed his audience from the outset that his was a cumulative case structured on dozens of individual small bits of evidence which collectively would demonstrate the antiquity and internal coherence of Genesis. But as I have shown at length through nearly 3 hours of videos, these are almost all entirely points of no substance, which are arguably so by design, as a means to misdirect his viewers. His presentation of evidence is glib, it's hurried, and Jones barely makes any effort at all to expand upon most of them. It is easier and more convincing on the surface of things to overwhelm your audience with data, regardless of its relevance to your case. It's a gish gallop, and it's disingenuous. Third, Jones either irresponsibly presents himself as an expert and then misunderstands the entire enterprise of modern critical biblical scholarship, or, even worse, he deliberately misrepresents critical biblical scholarship as a means to assuage the mounting insecurities of evangelicals who are more and more often confronted by devastating challenges to their theological house of cards. Is this really someone that Christians should trust to provide them with information about the Bible?
Are these really the questions that I was called here to answer? Phone calls and footlockers? Please tell me that you have something more, Lieutenant. These 2 Marines are on trial for their lives. Please tell me that their lawyer hasn't pinned their hopes to a phone bill.
I think the feebleness of apologetic arguments for Genesis and the rest of the Bible, like those that Jones has trotted out here, tells us everything we already knew about the manifest problems with Christian doctrines like those of inerrancy and the reliability and the historical usefulness of the biblical texts. The evidence is overwhelming. I'm Kip Davis. Thanks for watching.